In 1860, Elizabeth Packard disagreed with her husband about religion. He had her committed to an asylum without a hearing. No evidence was presented and no medical evaluation was required. Under Illinois law, a husband's word was legally sufficient. That word alone could lock his wife away indefinitely. Elizabeth spent 3 years inside the Jacksonville Asylum in Illinois, 3 years locked away from her 6 children at home. When a jury finally heard her case, they deliberated 7 minutes. 7 minutes to reach a unanimous verdict that she was sane. She had always been sane, and everyone knew it. So Elizabeth went home to reclaim everything she had lost. What she found there should disturb you deeply. The night before her release, her husband had rented their house to strangers. He had sold her furniture. He had emptied her bank accounts. He had taken her money, her wardrobe, her notes, her children. Then he left the state. Elizabeth Packard stood in front of her own home with nothing. And when she tried to fight back through the courts, she discovered something worse than what her husband had done. She had no legal recourse. Under a legal doctrine called coverture, nothing had ever belonged to her. Not the furniture, not the money, not even the children. Because the moment she married Theophilus Packard, her legal existence ceased to be her own. Everything she owned became his property. Every wage she might earn belonged to him. She could not sign a contract. She could not file a lawsuit. She could not write a will without his consent. And she could be committed to an asylum on his word alone, with no hearing and no right to challenge it. Elizabeth Packard's story is not an outlier. It is a case study in how the system was designed to work, and the document that proves it still exists. Between October 22, 1864 and December 12, 1889, the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane at Weston kept a logbook. It recorded every patient admitted and the reason for their commitment. Historian Marjorie Carr compiled that logbook into a pamphlet in 1993. It is now archived at the West Virginia Division of Culture and History. It contains 125 reasons you could be locked inside. Read some of them. Laziness, novel reading, hard study, political excitement, religious enthusiasm, disappointed affection, disappointed love, jealousy, greediness, egotism, bad whiskey, snuff eating for 2 years, imaginary female trouble, menstrual deranged, domestic trouble. That last one is worth pausing on. The very first patient ever admitted to Weston was a housewife. Her recorded reason for commitment was domestic trouble. Think about what that phrase could mean in 1864. It could mean anything. It could mean she argued with her husband. It could mean she was unhappy. It could mean she refused something. The vagueness was the feature, not the flaw. Because the more reasons you have to lock someone away, the harder it becomes for anyone to prove they do not belong there. Now, the fair counterpoint. Snopes investigated this list in 2016 and confirmed it was real, but noted an important nuance. These entries were recorded as supposed causes of insanity, not as diagnoses themselves. The physicians of the time even expressed, in their own words, a little unease with the categories. So the standard explanation is that these were contributing factors, not standalone justifications. That explanation is technically correct, and it completely misses the point, because the system did not require proof. In most states, a husband could walk into an asylum with his wife and have her committed on his testimony alone. No independent medical examination, no hearing before a judge, no legal representation for the person being locked away. The cause recorded in the logbook was whatever the husband said it was, so the real question is not whether novel reading causes insanity. The real question is, who benefits when a woman who reads novels can be removed from her home and separated from her children? Who benefits when everything she might inherit is stripped away by a man who decides she is inconvenient? And I want you to sit with that question. Because once you see this mechanism clearly, the list stops looking absurd. It starts looking comprehensive. Deliberately comprehensive, a net wide enough to catch anyone who needed catching. This is where the story gets darker, because the asylum was not only used against women. In 1851, a Louisiana physician named Samuel Cartwright delivered a paper to the Medical Association of Louisiana. In it, he identified what he called a new mental illness. He named it drapetomania, combining the Greek words for runaway slave and madness. The disease, according to Cartwright, was the irrational desire of enslaved people to escape captivity. His reasoning was simple. Slavery was such a benefit to the enslaved that only mental illness could explain wanting to leave it. His prescribed treatment was whipping. For severe cases, he recommended amputating both big toes to make escape physically impossible. This was published in DeBow's Review, one of the most widely circulated publications in the American South. It was not fringe material. It was the chairman of a state medical association committee presenting at an annual meeting. And he did not stop there. Cartwright also diagnosed something he called dysesthesia aethiopica, the disease that supposedly caused laziness among enslaved people. The cure was hard outdoor labor under white supervision. Now, Northern publications mocked these diagnoses. Frederick Law Olmsted, the architect who designed Central Park, wrote a satirical response suggesting the disease must be of European origin, since white indentured servants also fled their masters. But here is what unsettles me. The term drapetomania remained in the Stedman's Practical Medical Dictionary through its third edition in 1914. Over 60 years after it was coined, it was still being treated as a legitimate medical term. The joke was on the page, but nobody removed it. After the Civil War ended, the pattern did not stop. It accelerated. The 1840 census had already falsely reported that free black people in northern states had an insanity rate 10 times greater than enslaved people in the South. Secretary of State John Calhoun used this fraudulent data to argue that freedom itself was driving black Americans insane. When the war ended and 4 million people were suddenly free, the asylum system was waiting. In 1870, Virginia opened the Central Lunatic Asylum for Colored Insane. It was the first institution in the country designated specifically for African American patients. Researchers who have examined its records found no evidence that any patient ever voluntarily committed themselves. Doctors at the facility prescribed hard farm labor as treatment. Patients worked the fields and performed domestic chores. If that sounds familiar, it should. The asylum opened 5 years after emancipation, and the treatment looked remarkably like what had come before it. A large percentage of patients died from diseases caused by overcrowding. Segregated facilities for black patients persisted until 1964, and some Virginia institutions remained segregated until 1967. The mechanism was the same. The population changed. The purpose did not. And then there is Canton. In 1898, Congress authorized the creation of the only federally funded mental institution for Native Americans in the United States. It opened in 1902 in Canton, South Dakota. But it was not built because of a mental health crisis among indigenous people. It was built because 2 South Dakota congressmen, including Senator Richard Pettigrew, wanted federal jobs and money for their struggling new state. That state had been carved directly out of indigenous homelands. Over 30 years, more than 350 Native Americans from tribes across the country were forcibly committed to Canton. The reasons for commitment included refusing to conform to government policies, practicing traditional spiritual ceremonies, and being uncooperative with federal authorities. One man from the Rosebud Reservation was given the diagnosis of horse-stealing mania. No interpreters were provided. No mental evaluations were conducted. No therapeutic programs existed. Patients were shackled to beds. The facility was described by investigators as caked in soot, with patients lying in their own waste. At least 121 people died there. More than half died from diseases that were entirely curable. Canton became known as the threats behind the boarding schools. Elders have testified that Native children at federal boarding schools were told that if they misbehaved, they would be sent to Canton. And everyone understood that Canton was a death sentence. When Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier finally shut the facility down in 1933, the residents of Canton fought in federal court to keep it open. Not for the patients, for the economy. The asylum was a major employer during the Depression. Today, the building is gone. A municipal golf course was built in its place. The cemetery where 121 men, women, children, and newborns are buried sits near the 5th hole. I keep trying to find the version of this story where the system was broken, where good people built something humane and it went wrong over time, where the failures were accidental. But I cannot find it, because in Contra Costa County, California, in 1883, court records show a couple from Portugal, both declared insane. A judge noted in his own handwriting that the husband was poor and could not pay. But on the same page, he recorded that the wife held 74 acres of land in her name. Their estate was appraised and sold. Guardians were appointed for their 3 children. The historian Richard Fox found that California had the highest rate of insane commitments in the nation during this period, and a superintendent of one of the state asylums put it plainly. He said the hospitals would continue to be the receptacle for all forms of human wreckage, regardless of law and justice. He said it himself. He was not ashamed of it. Once you were inside, the system could take more than your freedom. In 1927, the Supreme Court decided Buck v. Bell. Carrie Buck was 18 years old. She had been classified as feeble-minded after becoming pregnant. But Carrie Buck was not feeble-minded. She had been raped by her foster parents' nephew. Her foster parents claimed her pregnancy was evidence of promiscuity, and they had her committed. The state of Virginia selected her as a test case for its sterilization law. The case went to the Supreme Court. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinion. 8 justices agreed with him. Only 1 dissented. Holmes wrote that society could prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind, and he concluded with 5 words that still echo. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie Buck was sterilized against her will. She was not told what was being done to her. After 1927, more than 30 states enacted sterilization laws. Over 60,000 Americans were sterilized without their consent, from the 20s through the mid-70s. Before the ruling, roughly half of those sterilized were men. After, 67% were women. Many were admitted to institutions specifically to be sterilized, then released. It was so common among poor white women in the South that the procedure acquired a nickname. The Virginia law that authorized Carrie Buck's sterilization directly inspired Nazi Germany's 1933 sterilization program. The Nazis carried out 375,000 forced sterilizations. At the Nuremberg trials, defendants cited Buck v. Bell in their defense. The Supreme Court has never formally overruled that decision. It remains on the books. In 1887, a 23-year-old journalist named Nellie Bly accepted an assignment from Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. She would feign insanity and get herself committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island to report on conditions from the inside. She used the name Nellie Brown, checked into a boarding house, and convinced a judge and multiple doctors that she was mentally ill. Once inside, she immediately dropped the act. She talked normally. She behaved normally. She made no attempt to seem insane, and the staff did not notice. The more sanely she acted, the crazier they believed her to be. During her 10 days inside, Bly found women committed by vindictive husbands. She found immigrants who spoke no English, trapped in a system they could not navigate. Patients were beaten. They were given ice-cold baths in water that was rarely changed. They were forbidden from reading or writing. Her report, published on October 9, 1887, triggered a grand jury investigation. The city increased the asylum's budget by $850,000. The asylum closed 7 years later. But Bly's most important observation was not about the conditions. It was about how easy it was to enter and how impossible it was to leave. She proved in 10 days what Elizabeth Packard had spent a lifetime trying to explain. The system was not designed to identify the insane. It was designed to hold whoever was placed inside it. Pull back far enough, and the individual stories become a single mechanism. The admission list at Weston. The coverture laws that erased a woman's legal existence. Drapetomania, turning the desire for freedom into a diagnosis. Canton, turning native spiritual practice into grounds for commitment. Buck v. Bell, turning poverty and victimhood into justification for sterilization. These are not separate failures. They are the same system applied to different populations at different moments. The asylum was a tool for removing inconvenient people. The admission list was the justification, and the beneficiaries were always the same. The husband who wanted his wife's property, the employer who wanted compliant labor, the state that wanted to develop land someone else was already living on, the institution that needed beds filled to justify its own budget and keep its funding flowing. Every time the question answers itself, who benefits? Maybe I am connecting things that are not connected. Maybe the admission list really was just clumsy record-keeping by overwhelmed physicians. Maybe coverture was just an outdated legal relic, not a weapon. Maybe Canton was just a poorly run institution, not a prison disguised as a hospital. But if that is true, then why does the pattern repeat with such unsettling precision? Why does every population that cannot fight back end up inside the same kind of walls, under the same kind of authority, losing the same kind of things? Your property, your children, your bodily autonomy, your name on a cemetery marker near a golf course that no one visits. How many of your own ancestors might have disappeared into a system like this? How many family lines were broken not by death or misfortune, but by someone with authority filling out a form? How many inheritances changed hands because a husband or a judge or a senator decided someone was inconvenient? The list from Weston includes 125 reasons, but it only ever needed one. Someone with power decided you did not belong. And the paperwork wrote itself.